He called up Irene and said, "Hey, why are you doing this to me? You didn't have anything before." And she didn't. That's true. He helped create a character that was terrifically advantageous to her. Irene got upset and she got hurt.
Max Baer Jr. is the last man standing. At 88 years old, the man we knew as Jethro Bodine is finally ready to drop the act. For years, rumors swirled about what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling on the set of the Beverly Hillbillies. Was the granny we loved actually a terror behind the scenes? Max is finally setting the record straight, and the truth about Irene Ryan is a lot more complicated than a bowl of victuals. The last hillbilly Max Baer Jr. sits in his home today, quite a stark contrast to the chaotic, laugh-track-filled world of 60s television. At 88 years old, he isn't just an actor, he's a living time capsule. He is the last surviving member of the Core Four from the Beverly Hillbillies. Buddy Ebsen, Donna Douglas, and the legendary Irene Ryan are all gone. When you're the last one left, the memories start to feel a lot heavier. People still see him and expect to see Jethro Bodine, the big, goofy kid looking for his next career as a brain surgeon or a double-knot spy. But Max was always much sharper than the character he played. He's spent decades guarding the legacy of the show, but being the lone survivor has changed his perspective. For years, he kept the secrets of the set locked away out of respect. He didn't want to ruin the magic for the fans who still watch the reruns every single day. But time has a way of stripping away the need for PR-friendly answers. Max knows that if he doesn't tell the real story now, it might get lost forever. He's seen the documentaries and read the books, and he's tired of the polished, fake versions of what went on behind the scenes. The biggest mystery of all? The woman who played Daisy Granny Moses. To the world, she was the feisty, pint-sized powerhouse who kept the clan in line with a wooden spoon and a pot of moonshine. But behind that gray wig and those wire-rimmed glasses was a woman Max knew better than almost anyone else. They spent thousands of hours together in the dirt of the studio backlit and under the scorching heat of the stage lights. Max remembers the smell of the tobacco, the sharp tongue that could cut a director in half, and the lonely heart of a woman who had given everything to show business. He's ready to talk about the friction, the late-night rehearsals, and the moments when the sweet old lady act vanished the second the director yelled cut. This isn't about being mean, it's about being honest. It's time to talk about the real Irene. The world saw a sweet grandma, but the studio saw a force of nature. Finding the right person to play Daisy Moses wasn't just a casting call, it was a desperate hunt. Paul Henning, the guy who created the show, had a massive hit on his hands, but he knew the whole thing would flop if he didn't find a woman who could be both terrifying and lovable at the same time. The character was written as a tiny powerhouse, a woman who looked like a breeze could blow her over but had the internal strength of a freight train. They looked at dozens of actresses, but nobody quite hit the mark. Some were too sweet, and others were just plain old. Paul didn't want an actress in a costume, he wanted a force of nature. Enter Irene Ryan. By the time she walked into the audition, Irene was already a veteran of the industry. She had spent years in vaudeville and radio, honing a sense of comedic timing that was sharp enough to shave with. But Hollywood is a tough place for a woman of a certain age, and Irene knew this might be her last big shot. She didn't just walk into the room, she took it over. Max remembers hearing about that first audition. Irene didn't ask for the part, she demanded it through her performance. She understood that Granny wasn't just a sidekick, she was the engine of the family. When she did her screen test with Buddy Ebsen, the chemistry was instant. Buddy was tall and laid back, and Irene was this spark plug that kept him on his toes. But there was a catch. The network executives were worried. They thought Irene might be too much or perhaps not Granny-like enough in real life. You see, off camera, Irene was a sophisticated woman. She liked her fashion, she liked her privacy, and she didn't look a bit like a mountain woman. She had to prove she could transform. She went home, grabbed an old raggedy dress, pulled her hair back into a tight, messy bun, and ditched the Hollywood glamour. When she came back, the executives didn't even recognize her. That was the moment the show truly began. Max recalls that Irene's dedication to the role was intense from day one. She knew that the comedy only worked if Granny was 100% believable. If the audience sensed she was just an actress in a wig, the joke was over. She fought for the character's integrity, often arguing with writers if she felt a line didn't sound like something a woman from the hills would say. She wasn't just looking for a paycheck, she was looking to build a legend. She brought a grit to the set that caught the younger actors off guard. Max realized very quickly that he wasn't just working with a co-star, he was working with a master class in survival. But looking the part was only half the battle, staying in it was the real trick. The mask of makeup every morning, long before the sun hit the hills of Bel Air, Irene Ryan was sitting in a cold trailer. Most people don't realize that Irene wasn't actually that old when the show started. She was in her late 50s, but she had to play a woman who looked like she'd been cured in a smokehouse for 80 years. The transformation was a brutal process. It wasn't just a quick dab of powder and a wig. It was an hour-long ordeal involving heavy grease paint, spirit gum, and deep lines drawn into her skin to catch the light. Max remembers seeing her arrive looking like a polished Hollywood professional and watching her slowly vanish under layers of old age. Irene hated the process, but she loved the result. She knew that the mask of Granny was her greatest weapon. Once that wig was pinned down and the wire-rimmed glasses were perched on her nose, Irene Ryan disappeared. Even her posture changed. She would hunch her shoulders and pick up that signature, frantic pace. Max often joked that the makeup acted like a battery. The more haggard she looked, the more energy she seemed to have. But the heavy chemicals took a toll. Wearing that thick stage makeup under the hot California sun for 12 hours a day was exhausting. It made her skin raw and her eyes tired. Despite the physical discomfort, Irene refused to lighten the load. She insisted the makeup look gritty and real. She didn't want to be a cute TV grandma, she wanted to be the tough-as-nails woman who survived the Ozarks. Max saw how this mask changed the way people treated her on set. When she was in character, even the directors were a little bit afraid of her. She used that fear to keep the set running on time. She was a pro, and she didn't have patience for anyone who wasn't prepared. The mask also gave her a strange kind of anonymity. When the makeup came off at the end of the day, Irene could walk through a grocery store, and nobody would know she was the most famous grandmother in America. She cherished that. She lived a double life, one as a glamorous, wealthy woman, and the other as the Spitfire in the calico dress. Max watched this daily vanishing act with total fascination. Max remembers that Irene was the one who taught him the business of show business. While everyone else was laughing at the jokes, Irene was whispering in his ear about camera angles, lighting, and how to protect his career. She saw potential in him that others missed because they were too busy laughing at the Jethro character. She would pull him aside after a take and tell him if he was getting lazy or if he needed to sharpen his timing. It was a tough love kind of mentorship. She didn't blow smoke up his skirt. If he messed up, she told him. But if he nailed a scene, that little nod of approval from her meant more to Max than any fan mail. Off-set, their bond was even more unique. They would often eat lunch together, sitting away from the noise of the crew. In those quiet moments, the granny persona would drop, and Max got to see the real woman. She talked to him about her years on the road in vaudeville, the heartbreak of the industry, and the loneliness that often comes with being a star. Max, in turn, became her protector. Because Irene was so small and the filming schedule was so grueling, Max would often carry her across the muddy parts of the backlit or make sure she had a chair waiting the second the lights went down. He became her muscle, and she became his brain. There was a genuine affection there that you can't fake for the cameras. Max admits today that he probably spent more time with Irene during those 9 years than he did with his own family. They developed a shorthand language, a look or a gesture that told the other exactly what they were thinking. When Max was struggling with the dumb guy stereotype that started to follow him, Irene was the one who told him to embrace it but never to believe it. She reminded him that playing stupid effectively required a very smart actor. She defended him to the producers when they tried to push him too hard, and Max stayed loyal to her until the very end. It wasn't all serious, though. They had a blast together. Irene had a wicked, dry sense of humor that would leave Max in stitches between takes. She loved to poke fun at the absurdity of their success. Here they were, a couple of actors pretending to be poor mountain folk while making more money than they ever dreamed of. Max credits Irene with keeping him grounded. She showed him that you could be a massive star and still be a professional who showed up on time and knew every single line. To Max, she wasn't just a co-star, she was the anchor that kept his ship from drifting away in the crazy world of 60s Hollywood. But behind the laughter and the bond, a darker reputation was starting to grow. The difficult label in the world of classic TV, there's a word people love to throw around when a woman knows what she wants: difficult. As the Beverly Hillbillies climbed to the top of the charts, the whispers started. People said Irene Ryan was a terror on wheels. They said she was demanding, that she had a temper, and that she was impossible to please. Because Max was the one closest to her, he heard it all. He saw the way guest stars would tremble when they had to do a scene with her, and he saw the way some of the crew members would roll their eyes when she started acting up. But Max has a different take on those rumors. To him, Irene wasn't being difficult, she was being a professional in a room full of amateurs. Irene came from the old school of vaudeville. In that world, if you weren't perfect, you didn't eat. She brought that same life or death energy to the set every single day. She had zero patience for anyone who showed up late, forgot their lines, or didn't take the craft seriously. Max remembers times when a director would try to give her a note that didn't make sense for the character, and Irene would shut them down in seconds. She wasn't doing it to be a diva, she was doing it because she knew Granny better than anyone on the planet. She protected that character like a mother bear. If the writing was lazy, she called it out. If the lighting was bad, she made them fix it. There were stories about her being cold to the fans or snapping at the press, but Max explains it simply: Irene was exhausted. She was an older woman working 16-hour days in a heavy wig and itchy clothes. She didn't have the off switch that some actors have. When the camera stopped, she was usually focused on the next 3 pages of dialogue she had to memorize. Max saw that what people called moodiness was actually just deep concentration. She wasn't there to make friends or win a popularity contest, she was there to put on the best show in America. She took the weight of the show's success on her tiny shoulders, and that kind of pressure can make anyone a little short-fused. Max also points out that the industry back then was a boys' club. If Buddy Ebsen demanded a change, he was called a leader. If Irene demanded a change, she was called difficult. Max watched her navigate that double standard with a sharp tongue and a lot of grit. She knew she had to be twice as tough to get half the respect. Sometimes, she would use her granny persona to get what she wanted, blurring the lines between the character and the woman to keep people on their toes. It was a survival tactic. She had spent 40 years clawing her way to the top, and she wasn't about to let a lazy production assistant or a bad script bring her down. Looking back, Max realizes that Irene's reputation for being tough was exactly why the show lasted as long as it did. She set a standard of excellence that everyone else had to meet. You couldn't be half in when you were standing next to Irene Ryan. She demanded your best because she gave her best, every single time. Max didn't see a diva, he saw a woman who refused to settle for good enough. He respected her for it then, and he respects her even more for it now. She wasn't difficult, she was just the boss. The iron will was there, but the body was starting to send out warning signs. The secret illness as the show rolled into its final seasons, the energy on set started to shift. Max noticed it before anyone else did. Irene was still hitting her marks and snapping out her lines, but the fire in her eyes was flickering. She was losing weight, and the heavy costumes seemed to hang off her tiny frame more than usual. But in true Irene fashion, she didn't say a word. She was from a generation that didn't complain and certainly didn't talk about weakness. To her, being sick was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had a crew of hundreds depending on her to show up, and she wasn't about to let them down. Max remembers the quiet moments between takes when Irene would slump into her chair, looking completely drained. The second the assistant director shouted places, she would snap back to life like a professional athlete. It was a terrifying transformation to watch. Max started keeping a closer eye on her, often bringing her water or making sure she had a bit of food even when she claimed she wasn't hungry. He knew something was wrong, but Irene made it very clear that the subject was off limits. She didn't want pity, and she definitely didn't want the network executives getting nervous about their star's health. The truth was, Irene was dealing with the early stages of the heart issues and the stroke that would eventually take her life. But at the time, she just played it off as getting older. She used the granny character as a shield. If she moved a little slower or looked a little frilier, people just assumed it was part of the act. Max saw through it. He saw the way she would grip the back of a chair to steady herself when the cameras weren't on her. It was a masterclass in sheer willpower. She was literally holding herself together for the sake of the show. Even as the series came to an end in 1971, Irene didn't slow down. If anything, she pushed harder. She took her act on the road and eventually landed a massive role on Broadway in the musical Pippin. Max was worried sick. He knew the grind of a live theater show was grueling even for a young person, let alone a woman in her 70s who was secretly failing. But Irene wouldn't hear it. She wanted to prove she was more than just a hillbilly in a wig. She worked through the pain, the dizziness, and the fatigue, keeping her secret locked away from the public eye until the very moment she collapsed on stage. She hid her pain to keep the world laughing, but her bank account was a different story. Money and fame. By the mid-60s, the Beverly Hillbillies wasn't just a TV show, it was a phenomenon. And for Irene Ryan, that meant a level of wealth she had never seen in her decades of touring. Most people assumed she lived like Granny, maybe tucked away in a quiet house with a vegetable garden. The truth was the exact opposite. Irene loved the high life. She had spent years playing small clubs and living out of suitcases, so when the big checks started rolling in, she knew exactly what to do with them. She bought a luxury condo in a high-rise, drove expensive cars, and draped herself in fine clothes the second the calico dress came off. Max remembers the contrast between Irene's real life and her TV life being almost hilarious. While Granny was screaming about pot liquor and possum innards, Irene was developing a sophisticated investment portfolio. She was incredibly smart with her money. She didn't blow it on frivolous things, she invested it. She became one of the wealthiest women in Hollywood, but she never flaunted it in a way that felt cheap. To Max, it was like she was finally getting the back pay for all the years she spent struggling in vaudeville. She knew that in Hollywood, money wasn't just about luxury, it was about power and independence. Fame, however, was a bit more complicated. Because the show was so massive, Irene couldn't go anywhere without people expecting her to be the Granny character. Max recalls how fans would approach her and be genuinely shocked to find a sharp, well-dressed, and somewhat private woman instead of the bubbly grandma from the screen. Some people were even disappointed that she didn't talk in that high-pitched rasp in real life. Irene handled it with a mix of grace and "don't mess with me" attitude. She valued her fans, but she valued her privacy even more. She didn't feel the need to be on 24/7. She used her fame as a tool. She knew that being Granny gave her a seat at tables she never could have reached before. But she also used that money for things nobody knew about until much later. She was quietly generous, helping out crew members who were going through hard times or donating to causes she believed in. Max saw her as a woman who had finally conquered a town that usually chewed people up and spit them out. She had reached the top of the mountain at an age when most people were being forced into retirement. To Irene, the fame was a job, and the money was the reward for a job well done. She never let the hillbilly brand define her worth as a person. Max often says that Irene was the most Hollywood person on the set, despite playing the most anti-Hollywood character. She understood the game better than anyone, and she played it to win. She went from a traveling performer to a multi-millionaire icon, and she enjoyed every single cent she earned. The money bought her comfort, but it couldn't buy her more time. The final curtain in the end didn't come in a hospital bed or a quiet room, it came right where Irene wanted to be, under the spotlight. After the Beverly Hillbillies wrapped, Irene didn't head for a rocking chair. She headed for Broadway. She landed the role of Baird in the musical Pippin, where she got to show off the singing and dancing skills she'd spent 50 years perfecting. Max watched from afar, both proud and terrified. he knew she was pushing herself to the absolute limit. Every night, she would climb onto a trapeze and sing No Time at All, a song about living life to the fullest before it's too late. The irony was almost too much to bear. In March 1973, the engine finally gave out. Irene suffered a stroke right in the middle of a performance. She was rushed off stage, and while she fought for a few more weeks, the damage was done. When Max got the news that she had passed away at age 70, it hit him like a physical blow. To the world, they had lost Granny. To Max, he had lost the woman who taught him how to survive in a world that only saw him as a punchline. He remembers the funeral as a surreal moment where the reality of their TV family finally shattered. Max stayed quiet during a lot of the public grieving. He didn't want to give the media a soundbite or a fake tear. He was mourning the woman who used to sit in the dirt with him and talk about real life. He thought about how she had worked until the very last second, literally giving her life to the audience.